Hi, I'm Brittany, a neurodivergent mum and speech pathologist. This is Not Just Theories, where I share what actually works in my real, messy life. Because life doesn't follow a theory. Here's what I actually do. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Not Just Theories. Today's episode is a little bit different from the rest of the sleep series. So far we've been talking about baby sleep, things like the circadian rhythm, sleep needs, medical barriers, allergies, sensory differences. But today I'm going to talk about something that gets overlooked in sleep conversations: adult sleep. Because when you're parenting a baby who wakes frequently, whether that's because they're young or they have higher needs or because of some of the factors that I've already talked about, the reality is that your sleep is affected too. And most advice for parents in that situation can be incredibly unhelpful. So today I want to talk about the things that actually helped me maximize the sleep I could get during these very intense phases. So they are not perfect solutions. They are survival strategies because, there is that classic advice: sleep when the baby sleeps. And in theory, this sounds really sensible, but in practice is just incredibly frustrating advice. Because when the baby sleeps, a lot of other things also need to happen. You might need to eat or shower or wash your clothes or cook some food, clean bottles or pump parts, tidy the kitchen, respond to messages, or just enjoy a moment of quiet. And sometimes babies' sleep stretches are so short that sleeping isn't realistic anyway. If your baby is only sleeping for 20 minutes, that is barely enough time to close your eyes before they wake again. So when people repeat sleep when the baby sleeps as if it's the obvious solution, it can be incredibly dismissive of the reality parents are living in. Sometimes it's possible if you have a child who takes 2 to 3 hour naps or wakes every 3 hours overnight. You can sleep when the baby sleeps and get a reasonable amount of sleep. But if you have a lower sleep needs child or a child who wakes frequently, or you've got older children as well as your infant, sometimes it is not possible to sleep when your baby is sleeping. And it's not a personal failure. So for me, one of the most helpful shifts was something called radical acceptance. And that basically meant that instead of spending every evening anxiously wondering how many times is my baby going to wake tonight, or what if tonight is even worse, I tried to focus on accepting this is the stage we're in right now, and it is not forever, and it's just for now. So even though this stage ended up lasting multiple years, it was in the end only a couple of years, which, when you're in it and you've only been in it, if you've got a 6-week-old baby, I know me saying 2 or 3 years is a really long time. But time is a funny thing. And, now I've got a 4-year-old and an 18-month-old, and they both sleep reasonably well. And it feels like those days of sleep deprivation are far behind me, even though it's only been a couple of months. So multiple years of incredibly disrupted sleep. And, now that it's done, obviously we still have bad nights every now and again, or if my kid gets sick or something like that. But the difference of sort of reaching this next stage of parenting has been enormous. But one of the things that was the most helpful for me was just that leaning into this is the stage that I'm in, and it will not last forever. When I stopped mentally fighting the situation every night, it actually reduced a surprising amount of stress, because that constantly anticipating disaster actually did mean that I slept more poorly when I did have the occasional opportunity to sleep. If my child went for an hour and a half between wakes, but I was lying there expecting a 20-minute wake, then I wouldn't go to sleep. So just radically accepting the amount of sleep I get before my child wakes again is the amount of sleep I will get before my child wakes again, and it is out of my control. meant that when it was that hour and a half stretch, I actually was able to fall asleep in that time. Whereas when I was constantly anticipating that shorter stretch and then it ended up being longer, I always felt like I'd wasted that opportunity. So that radical acceptance of what it will be is what it will be meant that when it was a longer stretch, I actually managed to take advantage of it. So it doesn't make the wakes disappear, but it does make them feel less overwhelming, and it does mean that you can take advantage of any opportunities that do arise because you're more ready to fall asleep. When you're constantly stressing about sleep, it makes it harder to sleep when the opportunity does arise. So another thing on that topic that helped me was focusing on how quickly I could fall asleep when that opportunity arose, because that time it takes to fall asleep really matters when your child is really wakeful. So for me, I actually ended up starting to take melatonin at the beginning of the night because it helped me fall asleep faster once I got into bed. So I'm talking like a micro dose of melatonin. I had like 3 milligram tablets and I was taking like a quarter of a tablet, just enough to sort of knock me over the edge into making sleep a little bit easier. And it also minimized for me that sort of rebound effect of if you have too much melatonin in your system and then you wake up, then your melatonin receptors don't work again that next time you try and fall asleep. There's heaps of science behind it. I'm not at all an expert in it, but taking too high a dose of melatonin at the start of the night can actually mean you can't then take any more later in the night, or the melatonin stops working in your body. So taking like 0.5 of a milligram or 1 milligram meant that if I wanted to take another 0.5 or 1 milligram at 2 a.m., I could. And so that just sort of makes better use of those stretches of sleep before the baby is waking again, because you're actually not spending as much time lying there falling asleep. So obviously this is something you need to discuss with a healthcare provider, but for me it made a really noticeable difference. It's not something I did with my first child, it's something I did with my second child, and the same number of wakes, but me falling asleep more quickly was just enormous, the difference it made. So something else is just sleeping when possible. So even though that sleep when the baby sleeps isn't realistic, there are moments when it is possible. And in those moments, the thing that actually helped was me taking the opportunity. It is incredibly tempting when your baby finally goes to sleep to stay up scrolling your phone or watch TV or have a little bit of quiet time. And sometimes it is genuinely what you need. But in those moments when sleep deprivation is super severe, going to bed immediately really counts. It is hard not having any time to yourself, but giving up the time to yourself in favor of time to sleep makes a huge difference when you're running on that extremely fragmented and low level of sleep. Again, like I said earlier, that radical acceptance of this is the phase of life I'm in right now. I don't get to spend 20 minutes sitting on the couch watching TV with my partner before I go to bed in this phase of my life. In this phase of my life, I need to go to bed 20 minutes earlier instead of watching that TV show. In this phase of my life, I might not get to keep up with that favorite TV show that's just come out. I might not get to binge watch that just now. And it is a sacrifice, but it is a sacrifice that actually made a really big difference. And again, several years later, it doesn't feel like those sacrifices weren't worth it. I'm not sitting here thinking, oh no, I wish I'd watched that show as soon as it came out instead of waiting 6 months until my child was sleeping slightly better. It feels like a huge sacrifice in the middle when you're in the middle of it, because you already give up so much as a parent. Giving up that tiny little 20 minutes of staying up after your kid goes to bed just feels really hard. But 20 minutes of extra sleep every night for the whole week is a significant amount of sleep when you're working on those 2 to 4 hours of broken sleep a night. So no, you might not manage it every night. It's not always possible. You might already be doing this. But if you are not already doing this, I really encourage you to think about what's your priority. Is your priority your me time? Is your priority your sleep time? And that will change as sleep improves. I am now at the stage where I will regularly, after my child goes to sleep, stay up and watch, a 30-minute episode of TV or part of a movie. And it feels life-changing compared to where I was even 6 months ago. And a lot of freedom, and I feel like I'm regaining my sense of who I am just by watching TV, which is silly. But I don't regret having made the choices that I made for the time that I made it. And something else you can do is lower your standards for everything else, because if you are severely sleep deprived, survival is the priority. So we're not talking now about giving up 20 minutes of me time after bed. We're talking about maybe leaving the house a little bit messier than you'd like to wake up to it. Maybe delegating as many tasks that you can, even if you know that they're not going to be done to your standard by somebody else. So you don't need to keep everything the way it used to be. You just need to keep it at a survivable, manageable way. So for a lot of families, this is a time where outside help makes a really huge difference. Some of my friends hired cleaners and said it was one of the best decisions they made postpartum. Others relied on takeaway food or meal deliveries, or they had a lot of help from friends or family. For us, that level of support wasn't sort of readily available, but my husband did take on as much of the household load as he could, especially because our eldest had a really strong preference for settling with me, which is something that happens in some families, not because one parent is better or worse, but simply because of temperament. Whereas our second child was much more easily settled by my husband from the very beginning. So that individual temperament really shapes those experiences of, who's in charge of bedtime and who can put the child to sleep, and then who's in charge of everything else. So for us, especially in that really early postpartum time, the first sort of 3 to 6 months after my eldest was born, like my husband just did pretty much all the washing, all the cooking, all the cleaning when he got home from work. So I was often up in the middle of the night doing a night feed, and he'd be up in the middle of the night changing over a load from the washer to the dryer before he changed the baby's nappy. So it was really like a 24/7, all hands on deck between the two of us. It felt like looking after our eldest was 2 full-time jobs on top of, the full-time job my husband had. Was at work, which is quite interesting, because then my second child came along and he actually took a longer period of time off work because it had been such an overwhelming postpartum experience that first time around. So instead of taking 2 or 3 weeks off, he actually took nearly 12 weeks off, which would have been really, really beneficial the first time. And then second child, you'd think it would be harder because now there are 2 kids to manage. It felt more like he was on holiday. Not that he was on holiday. There was still a lot of parenting and cleaning, but between 2 adults, the amount of work left us with free time. Whereas with our eldest, with 2 adults and 1 child, the amount of work did not leave us with any free time. And again, that just comes down to the different needs of the children. Our second child napped reasonably well during the day. He didn't sleep great overnight from about 4 months on, but in that first postpartum period, he was actually a pretty good sleeper. And it was just a huge difference. Went on a little bit of a rant, but yeah, just really talking about, can you delegate jobs to other people? When you have visitors come over, can you ask them to do you a favor? My sister-in-law, I still remember, she came over. We were using cloth nappies for my eldest child, and she got really good at figuring out which inserts went with which brand of cloth nappies. Like, she just would come over and help fold the laundry, which was just so incredible. We didn't have a lot of local family, but she was around. And without her, I honestly don't know how we would have survived those first few months, because we didn't have local grandparents or anything like that. So we were very, very lucky to have my sister-in-law around. And she wasn't necessarily able to help much with the baby because she didn't have a lot of experience with the baby, but she was really comfortable folding, washing. So all those little things that if you've got someone around, it can feel a little bit uncomfortable asking for help. But I found most of my friends, if I was really confident with what I asked them to do, they were happy to do it. If I just said, oh, hey, while you're here, would you mind unloading the dishwasher? Or, hey, while you're here, would you mind just quickly vacuuming the floor? Because I had a Velcro baby and I was recovering from a C-section. I had a really, really bad recovery from that. Had a whole bunch of other physical things that meant that I wasn't able to use my arms or hands for a significant number of weeks. So I was quite disabled in my postpartum life. Other than picking up the baby, I couldn't really do anything else. I couldn't use my fingers. So having friends come over and just being confident about asking them for support with what they could help with when they weren't able to help with the baby was really important. Another thing that really helps is to remind yourself that rest is still beneficial even if you're not falling asleep. So closing your eyes, lying down, and deliberately sort of meditatively relaxing your body gives your nervous system a break. And we know that it is not the same as sleep, but it is still beneficial. Something, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's something like, an hour and a half of rest is the same as 25 minutes of sleep or something like that. So if you're lying there thinking, hey, this is pointless because I'm not sleeping, it might really help to reframe that. Your body is still getting something valuable from that rest. So if your baby wakes up after you've been lying down for 20 minutes and you hadn't gone to sleep yet, saying it out loud to yourself, I did not get to sleep, but my body was able to rest, and actually repeating it like a little mantra to yourself helps. Like it's a mental game. Like if you can tell yourself, I got benefit from that rest, even if I didn't fall asleep, you can feel so much less resentful, and you're going to get those benefits from it because you're not going to be increasing your stress rate and therefore not getting any resting benefits. Another strategy that really made a big difference for us was reducing how fully I had to wake up during the night. So again, this is where bed sharing played a role, which I've talked about before. So instead of having to get up, walk to the cot, settle the baby, transfer them back to the cot again, and then walk back to bed and then try and fall asleep, by bed sharing, I could respond to smaller wake ups, whether it was like by putting a dummy back in or doing a quick little pat and shush or a quick little breastfeed, much more quickly before the baby roused as often, and without me having to fully wake and moving my body around, which really wakes you up and makes it harder to fall back asleep. So overall, that made the night a lot less exhausting. So I know bed sharing is not the right choice for every family because safe sleep guidelines are really important. But for families with very wakeful babies, it can make nighttime parenting a lot more manageable. Not having to physically get out of bed to put your child back to sleep means that when they are asleep, it's quicker to go back to sleep. Another surprisingly powerful thing was trying not to look at the clock. When you're waking up multiple times a night, it is really tempting to track the wakes. Okay, that one was at 1:20, now it's 2:10, now it's 3 o'clock. I've already woken up 8 times and it's only 3 a.m. I've got to get up at 6 for the day. And that mental counting can actually make the night a lot longer and a lot more stressful. This is something I struggled with a lot. I had like an app on my phone that I wanted to update every time my child woke up. And, now it's good. I can go back and I can look at the number of wakes and really feel empathy for myself. I was not making this up. And I think that was part of it. I was trying to prove that I wasn't making it up, because if you spoke to people and you said, my baby woke up 11 times last night and you hadn't actually counted it, you'd sort of go, was it 11 or was it only 9? And can I really be complaining about 11 if it was only 9 wakes? For me, having that data almost felt like, here's the proof that I am going through this really hard thing that I'm saying I am. But it didn't help me get more sleep. Looking at your phone when you're waking up during the night wakes your brain up more, and that makes it harder to fall back asleep. So the combination of both looking at my phone and really counting that number of wakes and stressing about it was a combination that made it really, really hard to go back to sleep when my baby was finally back asleep. So keeping that environment as low stimulation as possible when you do wake up is going to leave you feeling more rested in the morning. Data can be really helpful, and I'm not saying not to ever track your baby's sleep. In fact, in the sleep needs episode, I actually asked you to track your baby's sleep, but thinking about doing it for a time-limited period. So you say, okay, I'm going to track my baby's sleep for the next 4 days. And for those 4 days, you do track every single wake just to get an idea of your baby's sleep needs, for example. But tracking your baby's sleep every day of their life for over a year, like I did, it wasn't helpful. And this is one of those things, power of hindsight, power of having a second baby. I backed off a lot on it, and it did make a huge difference to my mental health and my overall feelings of rest. I still, every couple of weeks, would do a period of monitoring numbers of wakes and things, just especially if I was thinking I might need to tweak the amount of day sleep, or sort of wondering if sleep needs had dropped because my baby was waking more. But I certainly didn't do it nearly as systematically second time around, and I really wish I'd stopped doing it sooner. Although having the data really helped me feel like I could advocate, but it didn't really help. I was going to the doctor and saying how many times my child was waking up, and I think I was dismissed anyway. So, having the concrete data didn't actually make all that much difference for us. Something else that can work if you've got a partner or a support person available is figuring out a way to split the night. So in the really early days, my husband often handled things like nappy changes, even though I was already awake to breastfeed. So I know in some families where there's a breastfeeding parent, the other parent does not wake up at night. And there's this idea of like, well, it's better to have one rested parent than two woken up parents. However, because my husband woke up, that meant that while he was changing the baby, I was able to eat something or drink water or use the bathroom, which especially in those early weeks postpartum can take a while. So that meant that once the feed was finished, I could go straight back to sleep instead of needing to get up and do all of those things. So instead of my wake up lasting for 45 minutes of, feeding plus 15 minutes of nappy changing in the middle, it was 40 minutes of feeding and 15 minutes of eating and going to the bathroom in the middle, so that at the end of that 45-minute feed, I just went straight back to sleep. So my wake ups were only lasting 45 minutes instead of an hour, which again, when you're multiplying that by 4 or 5 wakes a night, that extra 15 minutes each time led to me getting a whole extra hour of sleep. So it can really add up. And this isn't something you have to do every night either. So you might decide to go, okay, well, actually, it's been a particularly hard couple of nights, and tonight I just really need to prioritize all the rest I can. My partner's been able to sleep their full content the last 3 nights because I've done all the wakes. The least they can do tonight is the nappy changes and the rocking back to sleep at the end if the child doesn't go to sleep while you're actually feeding them. And I'm going to maximize my sleep. And yes, they are going to get 2 hours less sleep for you to gain that 1 hour of extra sleep. It's worth it. So always sort of each night discussing with your partner, if you've got a supportive partner, hey, tonight that 1 hour of extra sleep is worth costing you 2 hours, because it means that you're going to get a total of 6 hours and I'm going to get a total of 4. I'm still getting less than you, but I'm getting 4 instead of 3. And thinking about, yes, it's important for your partner to get rest because they might be doing something like going to work in the morning, and that's really important. But hey, in the morning, you might need to be looking after a baby and keeping a baby alive, which is a really important job. And if you're at the point in night feeds where you are struggling to stay awake for your baby, that is incredibly dangerous. And you need to do everything you can to maximize sleep, even if it is at the cost of someone else's sleep. So everyone will find their own rhythm for sharing the load. I know that for parents who formula feed, they might be able to do half the night each, and sort of each person gets a consolidated period of sleep. Usually if you're aiming for that, the evidence is about everyone trying to get at least 4 hours of uninterrupted sleep. I know that that's really, really hard when you're breastfeeding. Neither of my children have been able to go 4 hours between breastfeeds. So that wasn't something we were able to do. But find a system that helps you share the load overnight, or split the load during the day, whether that's just that you're the one who stays in bed when baby gets up for the day with your partner and you get a consolidated period of sleep in the morning. So even small pieces of support can make a really big difference over time. If every 4 nights your partner stays up and gives you that extra hour, then that's sort of on average an extra couple of hours a week, which makes a huge difference over 4 months' time. One of the biggest things I do want to emphasize in this episode is compassion, because sleep deprivation is incredibly intense. It is a form of torture. And when your baby wakes frequently, I think a lot of parents feel like they must be doing something wrong. But sometimes babies wake because they're young and they're sensitive and they're hungry or uncomfortable, or they're just wired that way. And the goal is not about perfect sleep, but it's about helping the whole family go through that stage of really tricky sleep. It is biologically normal for children to wake regularly through the night. It is protective against SIDS for babies to wake regularly through the night. And the way the modern world works with, lack of village, no one's living with grandparents or aunts and uncles, and there's not more people to split the load with, it means that we are struggling more than people maybe historically did with being alone and being the sole person responsible for a baby when the baby is not sleeping in a way that is conducive to adult sleep. So it's really hard. Have some compassion on yourself. And if you are listening to this while you are severely sleep deprived, I want you to hear this. You are not weak for finding this hard. Humans are not designed to function on broken sleep indefinitely. So doing the best you can in that situation is a huge achievement. This phase will eventually change. It might be a matter of days or weeks or months or years. But in the meantime, I hope some of the strategies that I shared today will help you get a little more rest wherever possible. It all adds up. Every tiny thing you can do to get more sleep, even if it's an extra 8 minutes because you fell asleep a tiny bit faster, adds up. Thank you for being here, and I'll share a little bit more next week. Thanks so much for listening to Not Just Theories. I really appreciate you being here. If this episode resonated with you, the best way to support the show is to follow, leave us a rating or review, or just share this episode with someone else who you think might find it comforting or useful. I hope to see you back here soon.